Hi all, in this lab, let us understand how to implement HTTP integration with API gateway. Okay. Now what we will do is we'll take a sample REST API and implement a HTTP integration with another API. Okay. And HTTP integration supports both the normal proxy integration, also the custom integration. Okay. Now we will see both aspects of this feature. So we have one AWS cloud. Within that, we have a REST API defined, okay, which is API gateway REST API, and the type of the endpoint is edge, and the name of the API is target API. Now the backend for this target API is Lambda function. The name of the function is items function. It will do some processing with respect to the input data and stores the input data into the DynamoDB table and also retrieve the data from the DynamoDB table. Okay. Now the target API has one resource called items and two methods, get and post, on the same resource. Okay. Now the input for the Lambda function is containing a JSON file, JSON object, which is having ID, price, and the name of fields. And the output from the Lambda is having one field called items, and the same thing is returned to the target API. Now, if you observe, there is no transformation happening between the input and output between the Lambda and the target API. So whatever the input is sent to the Lambda and the output coming from the Lambda, the same thing is sent back to the clients of this API. Okay, so there is no transformation happening. However, we will have one more REST API called HTTP proxy API, and the type of the endpoint is regional. Okay. Now, in this case, what we will do is we will have two resources slash proxy plus, which is like a placeholder. So you can have any value there, and the type of the method that it supports is any. That means it could be any HTTP verb. It could be get, put, post, things like that. Okay, and this is using a HTTP proxy integration with the target API. Okay. So in the HTTP proxy integration with the target API, there is no possibility to do any transformation between the input and output. Okay, so whatever the response comes from the target API, that will be sent back to the clients. But in the custom integration, that's where the slash store resource, and we have one method called get. Okay. Now here we will be doing a transformation. So for example, if the response is coming from the target API and it includes item for HTTP code 200, now the method response is updated with one more field called message store. Okay, this is being added. Since it's a custom integration, and there is a possibility that we can add an extra fields on top of what is coming from the target API. So this is the custom integration example that we are going to demonstrate. Okay. Now we will be having a client which sends that JSON file and gets this response back. Now if the client sends slash proxy API, there is no transformation. But if the client uses slash story API, then there is a custom integration. Okay. Now we will see this in action in the demo. Now let's go to the source code to see how to implement this entire architecture. Okay. In this lab, let us understand how to create the source code for the REST API HTTP integration. Okay. Now let us look at the API gateway .tf file. Okay. So API gateway -HTTP is a function is a file where we're implementing the entire functionality. Okay. Now if you go to the top, so we have one REST API called HTTP integration example API. So this is the entry point to the solution, and the type is regional, and the specification for this API is coming from OpenAI. Okay, so we have an OpenAI YAML file. So if I go to this folder, so this is the specification for the entire API. So we have slash proxy plus as the one of the resource. So the proxy is of type string and it is required, it is in the path. Okay. And with the integration, if you look at the input parameters, so the proxy is part of the request and it says a part of the path. Okay. And the type of the HTTP method is any. Okay. That means it can use get, put, post, any such method. And the integration type is HTTP proxy. So that means there is no customization required in this path. Okay. Now the URI, so that's the end HTTP URL that we are calling. So we are talking about one more REST API, which is a target for this API. Okay, so this is the target API ID. This is execute API region Amazon AWS.com slash the stage, which is dev in this case, and the proxy. Okay, and pass through behavior is no match. Okay, now there is one more resource called slash store, and it implements one method which is get, and it is basically using a JSON file, and there are two responses. It can have 200 or 404. So the responses for this method are 200, 400, and within the integration configuration, so here the HTTP method get is having the URI. So that means we are calling the slash items. Okay. So this is the endpoint that we are calling of the target API. Now there is a transformation also we have defined. If there is a 404 response, we are going to add a message store field to the JSON file, and the response is there is no item. But if the response code is 200, then we are adding message store. There is something around the corner, some message we are writing. Okay, just to distinguish between these two. Okay. Now the type of the integration is HTTP. That means it's a custom integration. So that means we are able to make some changes to the response coming from the target API. So this is a definition for the front end API. Okay. Now let us go to the other specification. Now the rest of the specification includes one more REST API, which is a target API. It's up to the type edge. Okay. Now we are defining one resource called items for the target API, and one method get. Okay. And the one more method post. Okay. There are two methods, right? Get and post for this resource. Now if you go further in the integration, we are saying it's a AWS proxy. That's a Lambda integration. So we are calling the target Lambda function, and the integration type is post. Similarly, for the post method also, the Lambda integration and the integration type is post. Okay. Now we'll be creating integration response. So there is no change here. It is straightforward. Whatever the response comes from Lambda, the same thing is written back to the clients. Okay. So and the method response also 200. Okay. There's only one response. Now the stage. So we are defining one stage called dev. Okay. And this is for both. Uh, so if you look at the REST API, this is the target API and this HTTP API. For both of these APIs, we are creating the deployment with the stage dev. Okay, and so the deployment specification is here. This is for the uh, target API, and this is for the REST API. Okay, so and there are some settings configuration. This is at the top level for the high level API. Okay, so now let us go to the console and see how this looks like. So I've already run Terraform init plan and apply to save time. Now let me go to the console and see how this looks like. Okay, so this is the API gateway console, and if you see there are two APIs. Okay, this is a front end API, HTTP integration example API, and this is a target API. The front end API is a REST API. Even the target API is also REST API, and the endpoint type is regional, and this is edge. Okay, now let me go to the first one. So here we have two resources slash proxy plus, and we have any method. Okay, now in the any method, if you see there is no authorization, no request validator, API key is also not there. So what we need to observe is the request path should contain a proxy. Okay, now proxy is a placeholder, so you can have any string there. So this is in the request. Now if you go to the integration configuration, the integration is of type HTTP, and the path is proxy, and here the endpoint URL. So this is the URL for the target API that we are going to see next. Okay. Now here we are mapping the proxy, which is the input in the path, and the path, the mapped item is here, method dot request dot path dot proxy. Okay. Now in the integration response, we cannot do any changes because it's of type HTTP integration. Similarly, method also no response, no change. Okay. Now go to the slash store, and this is having only one method called get, and here also no authorization, no request validator, no API key. Okay, and the rest of the configuration is default. The integration request, we are using HTTP type, but it's through custom integration. Okay, it's not the HTTP integration. This is a custom integration. That means we can make some changes to the mapping. Now, if you go to the integration response, now here we have two responses. One is the 200, another is 400. Okay, for 200 default response, if you see the mapping template, we are adding one more field called message store. Okay, and for the 400 also we are adding the same message store with a different item. I mean, with different output. So for the 200, we are saying there is something around the corner to distinguish between the 404. Here there is no item. Okay, that means 404 means there is no data available, right? So this is the integration response, and this is the method response. In the method response, there are two HTTP codes, 200 and 404, which are required because integration response we're mapping them, right? So this is how the API looks for the front end. Okay, now let us go to the target API. Okay, so in the target API, we have only one resource called items, and there are two methods. Okay, get and post. So let us go to the get first. In the get, again, no authorization, no request validator, no API keys. Rest of the configuration looks same. And the integration type is basically Lambda. Okay, Lambda proxy integration. And so this is the Lambda function that we're going to invoke. Okay, so integration response also not much. Okay, proxy integration cannot be performed. Okay, we're not making any changes, and the response code is default 200. Now, if I go to the post, if I go back to the method request, so it's more or less same. Integration is also more or less same because it's Lambda integration, and we're using the target Lambda function. And integration response also same because the proxy integration cannot be configured to transform. So, like we said earlier. Okay, now let's go to the Lambda function and see. So here there are two two triggers for this Lambda. Okay, so if I click on the API gateway, now there are two triggers. One is the slash dev items, another is the same. Both of them are same. The only difference is basically coming in terms of the method. So here is a slash post, here it is slash get. That means if you call slash post also, slash get also, this Lambda will be triggered. Okay, if you go to the code is a Node.js code, and it is manipulating the table in the DynamoDB. Okay, now let us go ahead and test it. So before testing it, let us first check the deployment. So we have one stage called dev, and all these APIs were deployed. Okay, so for example, for the target API, we have slash items, get and post, and this is URL. So the slash bits is from a previous demo, just ignore this for now. Okay, and for the HTTP integration API example, also we have the slash proxy plus any and the slash store plus any. Okay, so this is the URL. For example, if you go to stages, uh, yeah, so this is the slash proxy get, this is a URL to make any calls, and this is a URL to make any calls for the slash store. Okay, now let's first test this end to end using the console and also the command line. Okay, so to test this, let me first go to the front end API and go to proxy plus and any method, and here there is a test. Okay, now I will use the post method because it's any, right? I can use any one of these methods listed here. Okay, now for the proxy placeholder, I'll be using items. Okay, now in the input data, I will use one JSON file. Now let me click on the test button. So here if you see, the response coming from the target is put item so and so. Okay, so HTTP code is 200. Okay, now let us spend a minute to understand the entire flow. Okay, so here we are making a post call, and the slash proxy place is a template, so we are using items as a proxy value, and this is the input data. Okay. Now the request is basically going to this target API. So this is the REST API, which is the target for this API. Okay. Now in request body after transformation. So we are not doing any changes to the input. So it is as it is. Sending the request to the target API. So we got the response 200, and these are the headers. And so response body before transformation is put an item into this, and the response body after the transformation put an item. Okay, so there is no change. Whatever the response comes from there is actually returned back to the client. Okay, so because we are using a HTTP integration with proxy place, so that means we cannot make any changes to the response. Whatever comes from the target API response, that same thing has to be returned back to the client. So this is one example. Okay, now what we will do is the same example we will do a get. Okay, because this is any method, right? So it can support both options, put and post and get. So in the post, we saw input one JSON file and JSON object, and that is entered in the DynamoDB. And now in the get option, we are retrieving the data from the DynamoDB. Okay, so here, so if you see this request body, so we are not making any changes, and we are making a call to the target API, and this is the output. Okay, so the response from the target API is this, and this is before transformation, this is after transformation. So that means there's no change, both of them are same. Okay, since it is a proxy plus resource which is having HTTP integration and does not support any changes to the input and output from the target API, so it is sent as it is. Okay, so this is the demo for HTTP integration. Now what we will do is we'll go to the slash store and test the HTTP custom integration, right? And this is the, let us see how this changes the response, output from the previous example. So here, if I simply go to the store and get and go to the test and simply do a test. Okay. Now, if you see, the response is actually added with one more field called message store. Okay. Now let's go through the flow now. So input, we have not given any input. We simply did a get call. Okay. And the request is going through this target API, and these are the headers, and endpoint request body after transformation. So we have not done provided any input, so it's all empty. Send the request to the target API. The response, so you can see here, right? The endpoint response headers is this. Endpoint response before transformation is this. Okay, it is having this object. But method response body after transformation is this. That means we are adding extra field. Why? Because the slash store resource is using HTTP integration, HTTP custom integration. Okay, so that means we can make some changes to the input and output. So this is how we will be able to test the customization part in the HTTP proxy custom integration. Okay. Now what we will do is let us go through the console. Go to the command line and test the same thing. Okay. Now let us go to the CLI and fire some commands. Okay. Now here, let me first run this command to get the URL. Okay. So this is the URL for the front end API. Okay. Now if I call curl API on this, okay. So we are seeing this item, right? We are getting this response because I'm using slash proxy API. Okay. Since the proxy does not have any transformation, I'm getting this. Now if I use the other resource, other endpoint, which is slash store, and here I'm getting a different message, different output. Why? Because the slash store is using HTTP custom integration, which is supporting the input and output transformation, and this field is added extra. Whereas in the previous example, the output from the target API is sent as it is without any changes. But in this case, it has been changed. Okay, so this is how we can conclude the HTTP integration between the API gateway and the HTTP endpoint. And there are two types, right? One is the HTTP proxy integration where it does not support any transformation, and there's a HTTP custom integration where it supports some transformation, and that's what we have seen here. Okay, we can do one more thing also. So we have tested only the 200 flow. What about 404? Okay, let us delete the item from the DynamoDB. Okay, now let me go to DynamoDB table, and this is DynamoDB, and this is the table. So here let us see the entries in the table. Okay, and for example, explore the table items. So we have one field, okay, one row, right, in this table. Let me delete this. Um, okay, I'll delete this. Now, if I send the same API, okay, what will happen? Now, for example, if I simply use the first API, uh, okay, here we are getting the empty response. So what we will do now is we will simulate a 404 response. Okay, we will first delete the entry in the DynamoDB table and see if the 404 response comes. Okay, now let us go to the DynamoDB table. Okay, so this is the table that we are using it. So I'll go to the explore table and scan it, and if you see there is one row in this table, and I'll go ahead and delete this table. Okay, delete item. Now there are no more entries in the DynamoDB table. Now if we call the same APIs like we did earlier, now let us see what is the response. Okay, now here we are seeing an empty response. Okay, because there's no items in the DynamoDB, and since we are using the HTTP proxy integration, and there is no transformation possible, whatever the target API sends, the same thing is written here. But in the case of the slash store API, which is a custom integration, and we are able to add an extra field called message store with there is no items as a message. Okay, so this is how we can test the HTTP proxy integration and the normal HTTP integration with or without proxy, without customization, right, between the target API and the front end API. Okay, so this is how we can conclude the demo.